Eleanor's hands trembled violently as she fled her father's ranch in the dead of night, blood from her latest beating still crusting on her skin. The sudden silhouette of a lone horseman blocking her escape route meant either her end or her salvation, with no way to know which until it was too late. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The bruise on Eleanor's cheek had barely faded from purple to yellow when she made her decision. 3 years of her father's escalating cruelty since her mother's passing had hollowed her out, leaving nothing but survival instinct and desperate resolve. Tonight would be different. Tonight she would disappear. The old farmhouse creaked as Eleanor moved through darkness, each floorboard a potential betrayal. Her father's snores rumbled from his bedroom, the whiskey ensuring he slept deeply, at least for now. She had timed his drinking, counted the empty bottles, and calculated her window of escape with the precision of someone whose life depended on it. Into a small cloth sack went the essentials: her mother's silver hairbrush, a change of clothes, the money she'd secretly saved from selling eggs at the mercantile when her father thought she was at church. $23.47. Not enough for a new life, but enough for a chance at one. She slipped her mother's wedding band from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. The gold caught the moonlight filtering through thin curtains, and for a moment Eleanor hesitated. To take it felt like stealing. To leave it meant surrendering the last piece of her mother to her father's rage. She slid it onto her finger. Some thefts were acts of preservation. The kitchen door hinges had been oiled 3 nights prior. They made no sound as Eleanor stepped into the April night, the spring air cool against her skin. Above her, stars scattered across the sky like salt across black cloth. Below, the path stretched ahead, rutted and uncertain. 30 miles to the nearest town. 2 days of walking if she was lucky, 3 if the weather turned. She didn't look back at the farmhouse. There was nothing there she wanted to remember. By dawn, Eleanor had put 5 miles between herself and her past. Her thin boots, never meant for such journeys, had rubbed blisters on both heels. Each step became a negotiation with pain. Still, she pressed on, keeping to the tree line, avoiding the main road where her father might search once he discovered her absence. The sun climbed higher, burning away morning mist and Eleanor's remaining strength. When she spotted the creek cutting through a stand of cottonwoods, the pull of cool water and shade proved irresistible. She collapsed beside the burbling water, dunking her hands and splashing her face. Only then did she allow herself to cry, quick, efficient tears that served no purpose except release. "Got to keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice strange after so many hours of silence. He'll be looking by now, but her body betrayed her. The sleepless night, the miles of walking, the years of vigilance, they conspired to pull her into exhaustion. She curled against the base of a cottonwood, telling herself she would rest just a moment. Her eyes closed. When Eleanor woke, the sun hung low in the western sky. Panic seized her chest. Hours. She had lost precious hours. She scrambled to her feet, wincing as her blisters tore open. Her father would be searching, rage fueling each step, belt already removed from his trousers and clutched in his fist. A sound stopped her, hoofbeats approaching, steady and unhurried. Eleanor froze, calculating her options. The creek offered no cover deep enough to hide her. The trees stood too far apart to shield her from view. Running would only draw attention. She pressed herself against the cottonwood, praying its trunk might conceal her from whoever approached. The rider appeared from around the bend, his silhouette backlit by the setting sun. A tall man on a chestnut mare, his hat pulled low, rifle slung across his saddle. Eleanor held her breath, willing herself to disappear into the bark. The horse stopped. The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. He knelt by the creek, filling his canteen, his movements deliberate and calm. Then he spoke, without turning. "I know you're there. Behind the tree. I don't mean you harm." His voice carried the texture of gravel and distance. Eleanor remained still, heartbeat thundering in her ears. "You can stay hidden if you prefer," the man continued, securing his canteen. But night's coming, and these parts get mighty cold after dark. I've got food and coffee at my camp up ahead." Eleanor said nothing. The stranger sighed, turning halfway toward her tree. "Look, miss, I saw your tracks heading this way hours ago. Small boots, walking alone, keeping off the main road. Doesn't take much figuring to know you're running from something." He paused. "Or someone." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor swallowed hard. "How do I know you're not worse than what I'm running from?" she asked, her voice barely audible. A small smile touched the corners of the man's mouth. "You don't. That's the trouble with trust. It's always a gamble." He straightened, adjusting his hat. "Name's Thomas Blackwood. I've got no right to your story, and you've got no reason to believe mine, but I'm offering a fire, food, and safety for the night. Tomorrow, you can go your way, and I'll go mine." Eleanor studied him from her hiding place. Thomas Blackwood stood still, making no move toward her, his posture open and patient. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of sun and sorrow. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his beard neatly trimmed. Nothing about him suggested the coiled violence she'd learned to recognize in her father. "Are you a bounty hunter?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "No, ma'am, just a man with nowhere particular to be. And if someone comes looking for me, then they'd have to get through me first." The simplicity of his answer carried more weight than any elaborate promise. Hunger and exhaustion made the decision easier than it should have been. Eleanor stepped from behind the tree, clutching her small bag to her chest like a shield. Thomas Blackwood made no sudden movements, just nodded once in acknowledgement. "My camp's a half-mile upstream," he said, gesturing with his chin. "You can walk ahead if you'd prefer not to turn your back on me." "I'll walk beside," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the decision. Thomas mounted his mare, then extended his hand down toward her. The sun silhouetted him against the evening sky, turning man and horse into a single dark shape, rimmed in gold. His hand remained outstretched, neither demanding nor retreating. Eleanor hesitated, studying the calloused palm offered to her. Every instinct honed by years of her father's unpredictability screamed caution. Yet something else, something buried beneath layers of fear and suspicion, whispered that not all hands raised were meant to strike. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly as they met his. Thomas's grip was firm but gentle as he helped her settle behind him on the horse. "Hold on," he said simply. Eleanor's arm circled his waist, the unfamiliar intimacy of the position bringing heat to her cheeks. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, smell leather and wood smoke and something indefinably male. The mare moved forward with a smooth gait that rocked them together like a cradle. As they rode toward the setting sun, the vast Texas prairie stretched around them, golden grasses swaying in the evening breeze. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt the knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether Thomas Blackwood would prove savior or threat, whether her father would find her trail, whether her meager savings would carry her far enough away to start anew. But for this moment, with the warmth of another human being beneath her hands and the promise of food and fire ahead, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that escape was possible, that hands could offer help instead of harm, that the road stretching before her might lead somewhere better than the life she'd left behind. The sun dipped below the horizon as they rode, casting long shadows across the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the lonesome sound echoing across the emptiness. Eleanor tightened her grip around Thomas's waist, and he placed one hand over hers briefly, a silent reassurance that, at least for tonight, she wasn't alone. Thomas's camp was nestled in a small hollow, protected by a semicircle of limestone bluffs. The natural formation blocked the wind while reflecting the heat of his modest fire. It was the camp of a man who knew the land and its mercies. "Not much," he said, as he helped Eleanor dismount, his hands steady at her waist, "but it's home enough for tonight." Eleanor nodded, keeping her eyes lowered, a habit formed from years of avoiding her father's gaze. Thomas seemed to understand her caution and moved away, giving her space as he tended to his horse. "Mare's name is Penny," he said conversationally, unsaddling the chestnut with practiced movement. "Had her since she was a gangly colt, stubborn as the day is long. but loyal to a fault. Eleanor watched him from the corner of her eye as he brushed the horse down. His hands were gentle, his words soft against the animal's ear. A man could fake kindness to lure a woman into trust. She knew that much. But animals, they sensed cruelty even when it was hidden. Penny leaned into Thomas's touch, her eyes half closed in contentment. "She likes you," Eleanor observed quietly. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. "Most creatures do, once they figure I'm not a threat." His eyes met hers briefly. "It takes people a bit longer, generally speaking." He turned back to his saddlebags, retrieving a small iron pot and a canvas pouch. "Coffee'll be ready soon. Got some jerky and beans, too. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your belly." Eleanor stood awkwardly at the edge of the firelight, uncertain of her place in this man's temporary home. Her father had taught her painfully that every kindness came with a price. What would Thomas Blackwood expect in return for his hospitality? As if reading her thoughts, Thomas gestured to a fallen log opposite his side of the fire. "Sit if you like, or don't. I'm not in the habit of making demands of folks who've got reason to be wary." The simple acknowledgement of her fear loosened something in Eleanor's chest. She perched on the log, a small bag clutched in her lap, and watched as he prepared their meal with efficient movements. "You've been on the trail a while," she observed, noticing the ease with which he worked. Thomas nodded. "Going on 2 years now. Running from something." A smile touched his lips. "Seems like a question better suited to you than me, miss." Eleanor fell silent, chastened. Thomas sighed, stirring the beans as they warmed. "Not running from," he said after a moment. "More like searching for something I lost, or maybe never had." He shrugged. "Doesn't much matter. The journey's the same either way." The cryptic answer should have heightened her suspicions, but instead, Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly. There was honesty in his vagueness, no polished story meant to charm or disarm, just the raw edges of a truth he himself might not fully understand. "My name is Eleanor," she offered, the words feeling like a small surrender. "Eleanor Kincaid." Thomas nodded once, acknowledging the gift of her name without pressing for more. "Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Kincaid." He handed her a tin cup of coffee and a plate of beans with a strip of jerky. "Oh, it's not much, but it's hot." The first bite nearly undid her. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten food she hadn't prepared herself, food that didn't come with her father's criticism or indifference. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, while Thomas pretended not to notice the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. "Your father," Thomas said quietly, after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a while. It wasn't a question. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her cheek, where the fading bruise still marked her skin. "How did you know?" "Seen it before." "My sister," he trailed off, poking at the fire with a stick. Sparks spiraled upward into the night sky. "Let's just say I recognize the sign. Is she—" Eleanor couldn't finish the question. "Free now. Married a decent man out in California." A shadow crossed his face. "Took me too long to get her away, though. Some scars don't show on the skin." Eleanor nodded, understanding all too well. "He wasn't always cruel. After my mother died, something in him broke. Like her goodness had been the only thing keeping his darkness at bay." "Doesn't excuse it," Thomas said firmly. "Nothing excuses raising a hand to your own child." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "It doesn't." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its gentle pops and hisses. Above, stars wheeled across the vast Texas sky, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them. "Where are you headed?" Thomas asked eventually. Eleanor stared into her empty cup. "I don't know. Away. Somewhere he won't find me." She hesitated. "There's a town called Mercy Hill, about 3 days a walk from here." "I thought maybe—" "I know it," Thomas nodded. "Decent enough place. Sheriff, there's a fair man, name of Harlan Price. Not the type to hand a woman back to her abuser without asking questions first." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "You think I might find work there?" "Might. Town's growing since the new railroad spur went in. Always need for cooks, seamstresses, even teachers if you got learning." He studied her across the fire. You have kin there. Anyone expecting you?" Eleanor shook her head. The reality of her situation washed over her anew, alone, with no connections and barely enough money to last a week if she was frugal. Her father had kept her isolated, ensuring she had no friends or relations to turn to in exactly this situation. "I could take you," Thomas said, his voice careful, neutral. I'm headed that direction anyway. Be safer than walking, and quicker too. The offer hung in the air between them. Eleanor studied his face in the firelight, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motives. She found only a steady gaze that met hers without demand. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. Thomas looked away, into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "Told you about my sister. What I didn't say was that I was too much of a coward to help her when she needed it most. By the time I found my courage, she'd already endured years. She shouldn't have had to." He turned back to Eleanor. "Maybe helping you balances the scales a bit. Or maybe it's just the decent thing to do. Either way, the offer stands." Eleanor wanted to accept immediately, the prospect of safety and companionship almost overwhelmingly tempting. But caution held her tongue. "I'll think on it," she said finally. Thomas nodded, respecting her hesitation. "Fair enough." He stood, stretching his tall frame. "You take the bedroll tonight. I'll keep watch." "You don't have to." "I sleep light anyway," he interrupted gently. "And if your father's the type I think he is, he won't give up the hunt easily. Better safe than sorry." The reminder of pursuit sent a chill through Eleanor despite the fire's warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest, Miss Kincaid. Tomorrow's soon enough to decide which road you're taking." As Eleanor settled into the offered bedroll, the unfamiliar comfort of the rough blankets wrapped around her like an embrace. She watched through half-closed eyes as Thomas sat with his back against a rock, rifle across his knees, his profile silhouetted against the starlit sky. For the first time since her mother's death, Eleanor fell asleep without fear being the last emotion she felt. Instead, as consciousness slipped away, she identified the unfamiliar sensation warming her chest. Hope, fragile as a wildflower pushing through stone, but hope nonetheless. Morning arrived with the soft palette of dawn, pink and gold, streaking the eastern sky, burning away the night's chill. Eleanor woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day rushed back. She sat up quickly, eyes scanning the camp. Thomas was already awake, crouched by a small fire, coffee pot steaming. His hat rested beside him, revealing dark hair peppered with silver at the temples. He looked up as she stirred. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice morning rough but gentle. Eleanor nodded, surprised to find it wasn't a lie. Despite the hard ground and unfamiliar surroundings, she had slept more deeply than she had in years. Perhaps exhaustion had finally overcome vigilance, or perhaps the presence of someone standing guard had allowed her body to truly rest. "There's coffee," Thomas offered, "and a bit of cornbread from yesterday." Eleanor folded the borrowed blankets neatly before joining him by the fire. The morning air was cool against her skin, promising another warm spring day. She accepted the tin cup he offered, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, after taking a sip. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it chased the last vestiges of sleep from her mind. "To accompany me to Mercy Hill." Thomas waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply present. "I'd be grateful for the escort," Eleanor continued, "if the offer still stands." "It does." He broke the cornbread in half, offering her the larger portion. "We can leave after breakfast. Should reach town by tomorrow evening if the weather holds." Relief and apprehension tangled in Eleanor's chest. The decision was made. She was truly leaving her old life behind, venturing into an unknown future with the help of a man she'd met just hours ago. The magnitude of the change left her lightheaded. "My father," she said suddenly. "He'll be looking." Thomas nodded, his expression somber. "Figured as much. We'll keep off the main roads. I know paths most folks don't." He studied her face. "Is he the type to come armed?" The question sent a chill through her, despite the morning sun. "Yes, he has a shotgun and a revolver. She swallowed hard. "He's threatened to use them before. Said if I ever ran, he'd track me down like a rabbit." "Then we'll be careful," Thomas said simply. "I'm no stranger to watching my back trail." They packed up camp efficiently, Eleanor helping where she could, though it was clear Thomas had his own system. Within half an hour, all evidence of their presence had been erased. The fire doused and covered with dirt, the bedroll secured behind Penny's saddle. "She'll carry double for a while," Thomas said, patting the mare's neck. "But we'll walk some too. Give her rest. No sense running her into the ground." Eleanor nodded, approaching the horse cautiously. Penny regarded her with liquid brown eyes, ears pricked forward with interest. Eleanor extended her hand, palm flat, and the mare snuffled against it gently. "She approves," Thomas observed with the hint of a smile. "She's a good judge of character." Something about the simple statement loosened another knot in Eleanor's chest. She reached up to stroke Penny's velvet nose, and the horse leaned into her touch. "Ready?" Thomas asked, holding out his hand to help her mount. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before placing her palm in his. His skin was warm and calloused, his grip secure as he boosted her onto Penny's back. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach that she quickly attributed to nerves. Thomas swung up behind her with practiced ease, settling into the saddle. Eleanor tensed slightly at the proximity, their bodies necessarily close in the confined space. His chest was a solid presence at her back, his arms on either side of her as he took up the reins. "All right," he asked quietly, seeming to sense her discomfort. Eleanor nodded, forcing herself to relax. "Yes, it's just, I'm not accustomed to being this close to a man who isn't kin," he finished for her. "I understand. We can arrange something different if you'd prefer." "No," she said quickly, surprising herself with her certainty. "This is fine, truly." They set off as the sun cleared the horizon, heading northwest through stands of mesquite and rolling grassland. Thomas guided Penny with minimal movement, his body in perfect harmony with the horse beneath them. After the initial awkwardness, Eleanor found herself adjusting to the rhythm of their shared mount, her body unconsciously synchronizing with his. "You mentioned your sister," she said after they'd ridden in comfortable silence for over an hour. "Is she your only family?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She is now. Parents died when I was 20. Her 16. Fever took them both within days of each other." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. She felt his slight shrug. "Been a while now. After they passed, it was just me and Anna. Then she married that—" He stopped, tension suddenly evident in his frame. Her first husband wasn't a kind man. By the time I realized how bad it was, she'd already suffered more than anyone should have to. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to the story. "I was riding with a cattle drive when her letter found me," Thomas continued, his voice low. "Took me 3 weeks to get back. By then her face was, well, not like I remembered." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I wanted to kill him. Would have if Anna hadn't stopped me. Said she didn't want me hanging for murder, no matter how deserved." "What happened?" Eleanor asked. "I took her away that night. We rode double, just like this, all the way to my uncle's place in the next county. Her husband came looking, of course, found us 3 days later, drunk and waving his pistol." Thomas fell silent. "Did you?" Eleanor couldn't finish the question. "No, but it was close. Uncle's shotgun convinced him to leave. Last we heard, he died in a bar fight in San Antonio. Can't say I mourned." Eleanor digested this. "And Anna? Is she truly happy now?" The tension in Thomas's body eased slightly. "Seems to be. Her new husband's a shopkeeper in Sacramento. Gentle sort. Writes her poetry, if you can believe it." A note of genuine affection colored his voice. "Got 2 little ones now, boy and a girl. Send me drawings sometimes when Anna writes. You must miss them," Eleanor observed. "Every day," he admitted. But Anna needed a fresh start. Somewhere her past couldn't find her. Somewhere she could learn to stop flinching at shadows. The parallels to her own situation weren't lost on Eleanor. "And you? Why aren't you there with them?" Thomas was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was barely audible over the rhythmic sound of Penny's hooves. "Some ghosts follow you, no matter how far you ride." The cryptic answer raised more questions than it answered, but Eleanor sensed it wasn't the time to press. Everyone had their secrets, their burdens. She was in no position to demand his when she'd shared so little of her own. They rode on through the warming day, alternating between riding double and walking to spare Penny. Thomas pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck oak where mountain lions sometimes denned, a hidden spring bubbling up between limestone rocks, the distant silhouette of a mesa that marked the halfway point to Mercy Hill. It was near midday when Thomas suddenly reined Penny to a halt. Eleanor, who had been lost in thoughts of what awaited her in town, nearly collided with his back. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by the sudden tension in his posture. Thomas nodded toward a distant ridge. "Riders, 3 of them." Eleanor followed his gaze. her heart climbing into her throat. 3 mounted figures were silhouetted against the sky, seemingly surveying the landscape below. Even at this distance, there was something familiar in the set of the central rider's shoulders that sent ice through her veins. "It's him," she whispered. "My father." "Get down," Thomas commanded, his voice low and urgent. He guided Penny off the trail and into a thicket of mesquite and scrub oak. The thorny branches caught at their clothes as Thomas dismounted, then helped Eleanor down with swift efficiency. "Oh, did they see us?" Eleanor whispered, her body trembling. Thomas's hand remained at her elbow, steadying her. "Don't think so." He squinted at the distant figures, suns behind them. "Makes it harder to spot movement below." He led Penny deeper into the thicket, where the foliage grew dense enough to conceal a horse and 2 people. "Stay here. I'm gonna have a better look." Before Eleanor could protest, Thomas was moving away, his steps nearly silent as he climbed the gentle slope of a nearby rise. He dropped to his stomach at the crest, pulling his hat low to avoid any telltale reflection from the sun. Eleanor pressed herself against Penny's warm flank, drawing comfort from the mare's solid presence. The horse seemed to sense the need for quiet, standing motionless except for the occasional flick of her tail. Minutes stretched like hours before Thomas returned, his expression grim. "It's definitely a search party," he confirmed. 3 riders moving in a standard sweep pattern. "Your father's in the middle, older man, grey beard, riding a bay horse." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "That's him. Ezekiel Kincaid." "The others?" "Probably Lester Jenkins and his son Caleb. They work his land. Do whatever my father asks without question." She swallowed hard. "They're not good men." Thomas's jaw tightened. "They're heading east now, following what they probably think is your trail. That gives us an advantage, but not much of one." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Thomas studied the terrain, his eyes narrowed in thought. "There's a creek about 2 miles west that feeds into the Brazos. Rocky bed, water running high this time of year. If we can reach it, we can ride in the water for a while. Leave no tracks. And if they find our trail before then?" Thomas's hand moved to the rifle slung across his back. Let's make sure they don't." They led Penny through the thicket, taking care to disturb the vegetation as little as possible. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot to Eleanor's heightened senses. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see her father's rage-contorted face materializing from between the trees. "He won't stop looking," she whispered as they emerged from the thicket onto harder ground. "And not until he finds me." Thomas helped her mount Penny before swinging up behind her. "Men like that rarely do," he agreed, his voice hard. "But they're not the only ones who can be stubborn." They rode at a careful pace, Thomas guiding Penny over rocky patches whenever possible to minimize their tracks. Eleanor found herself leaning back against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Oh, why is he so determined?" Thomas asked after they'd put another mile between themselves and the search party. "Most men like him. They'd be glad to be rid of a burden." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "I'm not a burden. I cook, clean, tend the garden, manage the house. Since my mother died, I've done everything." Bitterness crept into her voice. "That's why he won't let me go. Not because he loves me or would miss me. Because without me, he'd have to do the work himself. Or pay someone." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Ownership," he said finally. "Men like that, they think people belong to them. Especially women." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "That's exactly it." They reached the creek Thomas had mentioned, its clear water flowing swift and cold over a bed of limestone and granite. Without hesitation, Thomas guided Penny into the water. The mare picked her way carefully, apparently accustomed to this kind of travel. "We'll follow this for about a mile," Thomas explained. "There's a place up ahead where the bank widens and turns rocky. We can exit there without leaving obvious tracks." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his knowledge of the terrain. The water reached halfway up Penny's legs, occasionally splashing Eleanor's skirts. She didn't mind the dampness. It was a small price for safety. "How do you know these lands so well?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the fear still coursing through her veins. Thomas was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to share. "Grew up about 50 miles from here. My father ran cattle on open range, taught me and my brothers to read the land like most folks read books. Brothers? You didn't mention them before." His arms tensed slightly around her. "They're gone. War took the oldest too. Fever got the youngest same time as our parents." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "So much loss for one man to bear. Was a long time ago," Thomas replied, though his tone suggested the wound wasn't as healed as his words implied. "I taught me life doesn't make promises it intends to keep." They rode in silence after that. The only sounds, the gentle splash of Penny's hooves in the water and the distant call of birds. Eleanor found herself wondering what Thomas had been like before tragedy carved its initials into his heart. Had he smiled more? Laughed easily? The glimpses of warmth she'd seen in him suggested a man who'd once known happiness, but had learned to live without it. After nearly an hour in the creek, they reached the spot Thomas had described, a wide and flat expanse of sun-bleached stone extending from the water's edge. He guided Penny onto it, and they rode across the rock for several hundred yards before returning to softer ground. "We should stop and rest soon," Thomas said. "Give Penny a break and get some food in us. There's a place ahead that'll give us cover and a view of our back trail." The spot he chose was a small rise crowned with a circle of boulders, likely deposited centuries ago by some ancient flood. The stones created a natural fortress, with gaps that allowed them to watch in all directions while remaining hidden. Thomas helped Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. The brief contact sent warmth blooming across her skin, despite the gravity of their situation. "I'll see to Penny," he said, seemingly unaware of her reaction. "There's jerky in my saddlebag if you're hungry." Eleanor busied herself retrieving the food, while Thomas unsaddled the mare and rubbed her down with a handful of grass. The domesticity of the moment struck her as oddly comforting, a pocket of normalcy in a day defined by fear and flight. "Do you think we've lost them?" she asked as they sat side by side, sharing the simple meal Thomas chewed thoughtfully. "For now, maybe, but a man tracking his own daughter has advantages. He knows your habits. How you think makes you predictable." "I've never done anything like this before," Eleanor pointed out. "Running away, I mean." "True," Thomas acknowledged, "but he'll have ideas about where you might go. Towns nearby, family you might seek out." He glanced at her. "Is there anyone? Family, I mean?" Eleanor shook her head. "My mother had a sister in Kansas, but they lost touch years ago. My father saw to that." She twisted her mother's ring on her finger. "He made sure I had nowhere to turn but him." Thomas's expression darkened. "Common tactic for men like that. Isolation makes control easier. You know a lot about it, more than I'd like," he admitted. "Seen it too many times, not just with Anna." He fell silent, eyes scanning the horizon. "Speaking of which, we should keep moving. Your father strikes me as the type to have good trackers with him." They had just finished packing up when Thomas froze, his head tilted slightly. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a finger to his lips, warning her to silence. Then she heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats, approaching from the east. "They've found our trail," Thomas whispered, quickly checking his rifle. "We need to move, now." "But how?" Eleanor hissed. "If they're that close, they'll see us if we ride." Thomas's eyes darted around their surroundings, calculating. "And there's a ravine about half a mile west, deep enough to hide in, with a cave system, I know. If we can reach it." The hoofbeats grew louder. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "No time," Thomas muttered. He turned to her, his expression intense. "Do you trust me?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Eleanor couldn't fully grasp. Yet looking into his eyes, she found her answer without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." Thomas moved with decisive speed, grabbing his rifle and saddlebags. "Leave the saddle," he ordered, slipping Penny's bridle back on. "We need to travel light." Eleanor nodded, pulse racing as the distant hoofbeats grew louder. Thomas helped her onto Penny's bare back before swinging up behind her. "Hold tight to her mane," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear. "And when I say now, drop low and don't look back." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, Thomas guided Penny toward a narrow gap between two boulders, the only exit from their shelter that wasn't visible from the approaching rider's path. The mare squeezed through, her flanks brushing stone on either side. Instead of heading directly for the ravine he'd mentioned, Thomas guided Penny along the rocky base of the hillside, keeping to hard ground where hooves left minimal traces. They rode in the shadow of the rise, using it as cover from anyone watching from the eastern approach. The sounds of pursuit grew clearer. Men's voices carried on the wind, the distinctive creak of saddle leather, horses snorting with exertion. They were close, too close. Indeed, they'll top that rise in less than a minute, Thomas murmured. When they do, they'll have a clear view for miles. Eleanor's fingers tightened in Penny's mane. What are we going to do? Thomas nudged Penny toward a dense stand of cedar and juniper ahead. Something unexpected. They reached the thicket just as shouts erupted from the hilltop behind them. Eleanor risked a glance back to see three riders silhouetted against the sky, one pointing in their general direction. "They've spotted us," she gasped. "Maybe," Thomas replied grimly. "Maybe not. Either way, they know someone's here." He guided Penny into the heart of the thicket, branches scraping against them as they pushed deeper into the tangle of vegetation. When they could go no further, Thomas slid from the horse's back and helped Eleanor down. "Stay with Penny," he whispered, pressing his rifle into Eleanor's hands. "If anyone but me approaches, fire a warning shot. Don't hesitate." "Where are you going?" Panic edged her voice. Thomas's expression softened momentarily, creating a diversion. "Trust me, I'll come back for you." Before she could protest, he was gone, slipping through the underbrush with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to moving undetected. Eleanor stood frozen, the unfamiliar weight of the rifle in her hands, listening to the sounds of pursuit drawing nearer. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. Penny stood motionless beside her, the horse's ears pricked forward, alert but calm. Then from somewhere to the east, the opposite direction from their hiding place, came a sharp whistle, followed by the distinctive sound of breaking branches and rapid movement. Men's voices rose in excitement. "There, through those trees, I see something moving. Get after him!" The thunder of hooves veered away from the thicket, heading east. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she realized what Thomas had done, deliberately revealed himself to draw the pursuers away from her. Fear for his safety knotted in her stomach. The sounds of the chase faded into the distance. Still, Eleanor remained motionless, remembering Thomas's instruction to wait. Her arms ached from holding the rifle at the ready, but she dared not lower it. The sun had moved perceptibly across the sky when she finally heard soft footfalls approaching. Eleanor raised the rifle, finger hovering near the trigger as she pointed it toward the sound. "It's me," Thomas's voice called softly. "Don't shoot." He appeared a moment later, pushing through the branches. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, a thin scratch across his cheek beaded with blood, but he was whole and unharmed. Relief flooded through Eleanor with such intensity that her knees nearly buckled. "You came back," she whispered. Thomas's expression was unreadable. "I said I would." He took the rifle from her trembling hands, checked it briefly, then returned it to its scabbard on Penny's back. "Your father and his men are currently halfway to Sulphur Springs, chasing what they think is a horse thief," he explained, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Left them a false trail even a child could follow. Too tempting to ignore, and when they realize they've been tricked by then, we'll be long gone." He helped her mount Penny again. "The ravine I mentioned is less than an hour's ride from here. We'll hole up there until nightfall, then make for Mercy Hill under cover of darkness." They rode west, keeping to rocky terrain and shallow stream beds. Thomas remained vigilant, frequently stopping to listen and scan their surrounding. Despite his assurances, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that danger still lurked nearby. "How did you learn to do all this?" she asked as they picked their way across a particularly treacherous stretch of loose shale. "The tracking, the false trails, moving without being seen." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "War teaches a man things he'd rather not know," he finally said. "I scouted for the Union, learned to move behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, return unseen." Eleanor processed this. "You fought for the North. I fought against slavery," he corrected. "My family owned none, wanted none. believed every man deserved to control his own destiny. His voice turned softer. Every woman too, though that part took me longer to understand. Something in his tone made Eleanor's heart beat faster. She was grateful he couldn't see her face. They reached the ravine as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. It was deeper than Eleanor had imagined, a jagged slash in the earth, its walls layered in striations of red and gold stone. Thomas guided Penny down a nearly invisible path that zigzagged to the bottom. Apache used this place as a hideout for generations, he explained as they descended. Most white folks don't know it exists. Those who do tend to avoid it. Too many stories of ambushes and ghosts. Are the stories true? Eleanor asked, eyeing the shadowed recesses of the ravine walls. Thomas's soft chuckle rumbled against her back. The ambushes, certainly. The ghosts. Never seen one myself, but I tried to keep an open mind. At the bottom of the ravine, a small stream trickled between smooth stones. Thomas directed Penny along it until they reached a place where the wall curved inward, creating a shallow cave. The overhang provided shelter while allowing them to see anyone approaching from below. We'll rest here, Thomas decided, helping Eleanor dismount, and Jay give Penny a chance to drink and graze a bit. The sun no longer reached the ravine floor, leaving them in cool shadow. Thomas built a small, nearly smokeless fire using dry twigs and what looked like animal dung. Eleanor watched, impressed despite herself. Where did you learn that trick? Plains Indians, Thomas replied, carefully feeding the tiny flame. Fire without smoke. Useful when you don't want to advertise your position. As the small fire established itself, casting a warm glow on the stone walls around them, Eleanor finally allowed herself to truly relax. They'd escaped. At least for now. Her father was miles away, following a false trail. By tomorrow evening, she'd be in Mercy Hill, ready to begin her new life. The thought should have brought unalloyed joy, but instead, a strange melancholy settled over her. Tomorrow evening also meant parting ways with Thomas Blackwood. Once he delivered her safely to town, he'd have fulfilled his self-appointed obligation. There would be no reason for him to stay. What will you do? She asked suddenly. After Mercy Hill, I mean. Thomas looked up from the fire, his expression thoughtful. Haven't decided. Maybe head further west. Arizona territory, perhaps. Is there something waiting for you there? He shook his head. Just some place I haven't been yet. The answer highlighted the fundamental difference in their situations. Eleanor was fleeing towards something specific. Safety, independence, a fresh start in a particular place. Thomas was simply wandering. No destination, no purpose beyond the immediate journey. That sounds lonely, she observed softly. Thomas's eyes met hers across the fire, something unreadable flickering in their depths. Been alone a long time, Miss Kincaid. Gets to be a habit after a while. Eleanor, she corrected. After everything we've been through, I think you've earned the right to use my given name. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Eleanor, then. They shared a simple meal of jerky and the last of the cornbread. As night fully claimed the ravine, the temperature dropped noticeably. Eleanor shivered, drawing her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Without comment, Thomas shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her. The garment was still warm from his body, carrying his scent, leather, wood smoke, and something indefinably masculine. You'll be cold, she protested weakly. I've endured worse, he replied, settling back against the cave wall. Try to get some sleep. We'll leave before dawn. Eleanor wanted to object further, but found herself suddenly overwhelmed with exhaustion. The day's terror and exertion crashed over her like a wave. She curled up near the fire, Thomas's coat enveloping her like an embrace. Thomas, she murmured, already half claimed by sleep. Thank you for everything. In the flickering firelight, she thought she saw something soften in his weathered face. Sleep well, Eleanor, he said quietly. As consciousness slipped away, Eleanor realized that for the first time in years, she felt not just safe, but seen. Thomas Blackwood had looked at her and recognized not just a woman in need of rescue, but a person worthy of respect and consideration. In the strange alchemy of their brief acquaintance, she had become more than she'd been allowed to be under her father's roof. Tomorrow would bring Mercy Hill and all its uncertainties, but tonight, In a hidden ravine beside a smokeless fire, Eleanor Kincaid discovered she was no longer merely fleeing from something, she was moving toward possibility. Thomas woke her before dawn, his touch gentle on her shoulder. "Time to go," he whispered. Eleanor blinked away sleep, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings until memory returned. The small fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make out Thomas's silhouette as he prepared Penny for their departure. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. Thomas shrugged. "Enough." His non-committal tone suggested otherwise. Eleanor returned his coat, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders instead. The garment felt strangely cold without his warmth, a poor substitute for the weight of his jacket. She pushed away the thought as quickly as it formed. They ascended from the ravine in silence, Thomas leading Penny up the steep path on foot. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading one by one. By the time they reached level ground, a thin band of pink stretched across the horizon. "Mercy Hill is about 15 miles southwest," Thomas said, as he helped Eleanor onto Penny's back. "If we push hard, we can make it by midday." He swung up behind her, and they set off at a steady pace. The landscape changed gradually as they rode, rocky outcroppings giving way to gentler hills dotted with oak and pecan trees. Signs of human habitation became more frequent: fenced pasture land, the occasional distant farmhouse, a weathered signpost marking the intersection of little-used road. Eleanor found herself studying these markers of civilization with mixed emotion. Each one brought her closer to Mercy Hill, to safety, and to parting with Thomas. "Tell me about Mercy Hill," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. What kind of place is it?" Thomas adjusted his hat against the rising sun before answering. "Decent enough town. Grew up around a trading post, expanded when the railroad came through 5 years back. Has the usual: general store, hotel, saloon. Church is Methodist, I believe. School's been there about 3 years now. And the people, like most places. Some good, some less so. Sheriff's fair, like I mentioned. Mayor's a former Boston businessman named Hargrove. Bit full of himself, but honest from what I've heard." He paused. "There's a boarding house run by a widow, Constance Miller. Strict but kind. Might be a good place for you to start." Eleanor absorbed this information, trying to picture herself in this unknown place. "Do you think I'll find work easily?" Thomas considered this. "Town's growing. New families arriving regular. The hotel might need help, or the general store. And like I said, if you've got learning, the school could use an assistant teacher." "I can read and write," Eleanor said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "My mother taught me before she died. Made sure I knew figures too, though my father thought it unnecessary for a girl. Never understood that thinking," Thomas remarked. "Keeping knowledge from people doesn't make them better, just easier to control." The observation struck Eleanor with its simple truth. How many times had her father restricted her access to books, to visitors, to any source of information that might expand her world beyond the boundaries he established? "I think," she said slowly, "I might inquire about the school position. I've always loved reading. Might be nice to help others discover that same joy." She felt, rather than saw, Thomas's nod of approval. "You'd be good at it," he said simply. The certainty in his voice warmed something inside her. How strange that this man who'd known her barely 2 days could have more faith in her abilities than the father who'd raised her. They stopped briefly around mid-morning to rest Penny and stretch their leg. Thomas produced an apple from his saddlebag, slightly bruised but still sweet, which they shared, along with the last of their water. "We'll reach Taylor Creek in about an hour," Thomas said, studying the horizon. "Can refill the canteen there." Eleanor nodded, watching him as he checked Penny's hooves for stone. His movements were efficient, his attention focused completely on the task at hand. Everything Thomas did, she'd noticed, he did with this same thorough care, whether building a fire, reading tracks, or helping her mount. "Have you always been on your own?" she asked suddenly. Thomas glanced up, surprise flickering across his features before his expression returned to its usual calm. "Not always. After the war, I ranched with a partner for a few years up in the Panhandle." "What happened?" He straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "Drought came, cattle died, bank foreclosed." His voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of self-pity. "My partner headed to California. I moved on too, and since then, odd jobs mostly. Ranch hand, cattle driver, scout for hunting parties. Whatever keeps Penny fed and me in ammunition. He adjusted the mare's bridle. It's a living, if not much of one. The simplicity of his answer touched Eleanor. Here was a man who asked for so little from life, just enough to survive and the freedom to keep moving. Yet he'd risked his safety for a stranger, shared his food and fire, and now guided her toward a better future with no expectation of reward. They continued their journey, crossing Taylor Creek around noon. The water ran clear and cold, offering welcome refreshment. As Thomas had predicted, signs of Mercy Hill began to appear. More established roads, regular fence lines, the occasional wagon passing in the distance. "We'll be there within the hour," Thomas announced, pointing toward a smudge of buildings on the southwestern horizon. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, anticipation and anxiety mingling in her chest. So close to a new beginning, so close to goodbye. They were following a well-traveled road now, no longer needing to hide their trail. Thomas remained vigilant, his eyes scanning their surroundings with habitual caution, but his posture had relaxed slightly. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both stiffen. "We'll get off the road," Thomas said tersely, guiding Penny toward a stand of oaks. They'd barely reached cover when two riders appeared around the bend, moving at a steady trot. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the men, not her father, but the Jenkins father and son, his loyal followers. "How did they find us?" she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "They didn't," Thomas replied grimly. "They're likely heading to Mercy Hill to look for you there. Smart move on your father's part. Split up to cover more ground." The riders passed without slowing, apparently not noticing them among the trees. Once they were out of sight, Eleanor released her breath in a shuddering sigh. "What do we do now? If they're watching the town?" Thomas's expression was thoughtful rather than worried. "Changes our approach, not our destination. We'll circle around, come in from the north instead of the main road. And once we're there, if they're searching for me, Mercy Hill's not so small, you can't disappear for a while." Thomas adjusted their course, guiding Penny through a shallow gully that ran roughly parallel to the road. And men like that stand out in a decent town. Sheriff Price will take notice if they start asking too many questions. Eleanor wanted to believe him, but fear had rekindled in her chest. "My father won't give up easily." "Neither will we," Thomas replied with quiet determination. He hesitated, then added, "Eleanor, when we reach town, I could stay a few days. Make sure you're settled safely before moving on." The offer hung between them, significant in ways neither seemed ready to articulate. Eleanor's heart leapt at the prospect of not facing this new chapter entirely alone, of having Thomas's steady presence for just a little longer. "I'd appreciate that," she said softly. They approached Mercy Hill from the northeast as Thomas had suggested, avoiding the main thoroughfare. The town was larger than Eleanor had imagined, several dozen buildings arranged in a rough grid, with the promised railroad station marking its southern edge. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and the main street bustled with midday activity. Thomas guided them down a quiet side street, keeping to the shadows of buildings. "The boarding house should be on Cedar Street, near the school," he murmured. "We'll head there first, get you a room before those men can organize a proper search." Eleanor nodded, trying to calm her racing thoughts. So much newness at once. The town, the people, the prospect of building a life from nothing. The weight of it threatened to overwhelm her. As if sensing her anxiety, Thomas's hand briefly covered hers, where it rested on Penny's mane. "One step at a time," he said gently. "That's all anyone can do." The simple wisdom of his words steadied her. One step at a time. She'd already taken the hardest step by leaving her father's house. Everything that followed would be building rather than escaping, creating instead of surviving. They turned onto Cedar Street, a pleasant avenue lined with mature trees that gave it its name. Halfway down the block stood a large two-story house with a wide porch and freshly painted shutters. A discreet sign hung from the porch railing: "Miller Boarding House, respectable accommodations for ladies and gentlemen." "That's it," Thomas said, reining Penny to a halt at the corner. "Ready?" Eleanor took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "Ready," she confirmed. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her this far, one step at a time, into a future she would shape with her own hands. Thomas helped Eleanor dismount, then tied Penny to a hitching post in the alley beside the boarding house. "Better if she's not seen out front," he explained in a low voice. "The less connection between you and me, the better, at least until we know where those men are." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his caution. She smoothed her travel-worn dress as best she could and attempted to tidy her hair. After 2 days on the trail, she was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "You look fine," Thomas said, correctly interpreting her concern, "like someone who's traveled a distance, which is exactly what you'll tell Mrs. Miller." "What about my name?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "Should I use something different?" Thomas considered this. "Might be wise, at least for now. Your father will be asking for Eleanor Kincaid. I could use my mother's maiden name, Bennett. Eleanor Bennett." Thomas tested the name. Simple enough to remember, close enough to truth. They approached the front door, Thomas hanging back slightly to let Eleanor take the lead. She hesitated, her hand raised to knock, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was doing. Thomas's presence at her shoulder gave her courage. The door opened to her knock, revealing a tall, silver-haired woman with keen eyes and a mouth that seemed equally ready to smile or frown, depending on what its owner observed. She wore a crisp navy dress with a white lace collar, her only adornment a simple cameo brooch. "Yes?" she inquired, her gaze taking in Eleanor's travel-stained appearance and Thomas standing respectfully behind her. "Mrs. Miller?" Eleanor asked. At the woman's nod, she continued, "My name is Eleanor Bennett. I've just arrived in Mercy Hill and was told you might have a room available." Mrs. Miller's eyes moved from Eleanor to Thomas and back again, assessing. "Your husband and wife?" "No, ma'am," Thomas replied before Eleanor could speak. "Miss Bennett hired me as an escort from Nacogdoches. Roads can be dangerous for a lady traveling alone." The lie came so smoothly that Eleanor had to remind herself it wasn't true. She nodded in confirmation, adding, "Mr. Blackwood has been most professional. He comes highly recommended." Mrs. Miller seemed to accept this explanation, though her expression remained reserved. "I do have one room available, $3 a week, meals included. No gentlemen callers in private rooms, no liquor on the premises, and curfew is 9 o'clock sharp. Those are my terms." "They're very reasonable," Eleanor agreed. "I'd be grateful for the room." "And how will you be paying, Miss Bennett? Do you have employment arranged?" This was the question Eleanor had dreaded. "I have enough saved for the first 2 weeks," she said, hoping her meager funds would stretch that far. "And I'm seeking a position, perhaps at the school if they need assistance." Mrs. Miller's expression softened slightly. "The school, you say? You have experience with children?" "Some," Eleanor replied. It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd often minded the neighbor children when their mother was ill, and I'm well read. My mother ensured my education before she passed. Mrs. Miller studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "And as it happened, I serve on the school board. They've been looking for an assistant for Miss Winters. The children nearly run her ragged some days." She glanced at Thomas. "Mr. Blackwood, I assume you'll be requiring accommodations elsewhere." "Yes, ma'am. I'll see to Miss Bennett's trunk and be on my way." Another smooth lie. Eleanor had no trunk, only the small bag containing her few possessions. But the fiction gave them an excuse for Thomas to return later, once he'd secured his own lodgings and checked the town for signs of her father's men. Mrs. Miller led Eleanor inside, leaving Thomas on the porch. The boarding house was immaculately kept, with polished wooden floors and simple but tasteful furnishings. The scent of fresh bread and something savory, beef stew, perhaps, wafted from the kitchen at the back of the house. "But you'll be in the blue room upstairs, second door on the right," Mrs. Miller explained, leading her up a wide staircase. "Breakfast is at 6, dinner at noon for those who return home to eat, and supper at 6 in the evening. Bath day is Saturday, but there's a wash basin in your room for daily use." The blue room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, a pine dresser, a washstand, and a chair near the window that overlooked the street. Simple curtains in a faded blue calico matched the quilt on the bed, giving the room its name. "It's lovely," Eleanor said sincerely, setting her bag on the bed. "Thank you." Mrs. Miller. The older woman's expression softened further. You've come a long way, haven't you, Miss Bennet? And I don't just mean the miles. The perceptiveness of the observation caught Eleanor off guard. Yes, she admitted. I have. Mrs. Miller nodded, as if confirming something to herself. Dinner will be ready in half an hour. You can wash up and join us downstairs. You'll meet the other boarders then. 3 young ladies who work at the millinery shop and an elderly gentleman who keeps to himself. All respectable people. When she'd gone, Eleanor sank onto the bed, emotion washing over her in a powerful wave. She'd done it. She'd escaped, traveled across miles of wilderness, and found shelter in a new town where no one knew her. The reality of her freedom and its inherent uncertainty overwhelmed her. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Thomas standing in the hallway, a small trunk in his hands. Mrs. Miller let me bring this up, he said quietly. For appearance's sake. Eleanor stepped back to let him enter. He set the trunk down and lowered his voice further. I've secured a room at the Silver Spur Inn on the other side of town. Going to Stable Penny and have a look around. See if I can locate the Jenkins men without them spotting me. Be careful, Eleanor urged, surprising herself with the depth of concern in her voice. Thomas's expression gentled. Always am. He hesitated, then added, I'll come by tomorrow, mid-morning. Say I'm checking that you're settling in before I head back to Nacogdoches. What if they're watching the boarding house? Then I'll find another way to get word to you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small folding knife, offering it to her. Keep this with you, just in case. Eleanor accepted the knife, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Thank you, she said, meaning for far more than just the weapon. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Lock your door tonight, he advised, before slipping back into the hallway. After he'd gone, Eleanor explored her new room more thoroughly. The trunk, she discovered, wasn't empty. Thomas had left his spare shirt inside, along with a small pouch that clinked when she lifted it. She opened it to find several silver dollars. The unexpected generosity brought tears to her eyes. Dinner at the Miller boarding house proved to be exactly as promised. Punctual, plentiful, and served with minimal fuss. Eleanor met her fellow boarders, Sophia, Martha, and Jeanette from the millinery, and Mr. Holloway, a retired accountant who spoke little but nodded politely. Mrs. Miller ran the dinner table with benevolent efficiency, guiding conversation to ensure everyone participated while maintaining proper decorum. Miss Bennet is hoping to secure a position at the school, Mrs. Miller announced as she served apple cobbler for dessert. Oh, the children will love you, Sophia enthused. She was the youngest of the milliners, with rosy cheeks and an infectious smile. They're darlings, really, though they did put a frog in Miss Winters's desk last week. The poor woman nearly fainted, Martha added, shaking her head. She's a fine teacher, mind you, just a bit delicate for frontier children. Eleanor found herself relaxing in their company, the simple normalcy of dinner conversation working like a balm on her frayed nerves. These people knew nothing of her past, of her father's cruelty or her desperate flight. To them, she was simply Miss Bennet, a newcomer seeking a teaching position. The freedom of this new identity felt dizzying. The next morning, Eleanor rose with the dawn, having slept fitfully despite her exhaustion. The unfamiliar bed, the strange sounds of the boarding house, and worry for Thomas had conspired to keep her from deep sleep. She dressed in her cleanest clothes and made her way downstairs to breakfast, eager to begin establishing her new life. I've arranged for you to meet with Miss Winters at the school at 10 o'clock. Mrs. Miller informed her over breakfast biscuits and ham. I sent word last night, and she's quite pleased at the prospect of assistance. Thank you, Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the woman's helpfulness. I'll do my best not to disappoint either of you. After breakfast, Eleanor spent an hour carefully washing her spare clothes in the basin in her room and hanging them to dry by the open window. The simple domestic task felt different here, an act of self-care rather than obligatory service to her father. At 9:30, she was preparing to leave for her appointment at the school when a knock came at her door. Her heart quickened, hoping it was Thomas. Instead, she opened it to find Mrs. Miller. There's a man downstairs asking after new arrivals, the older woman said, her voice low and urgent. Says he's looking for his daughter who ran away from home. His description matches you rather closely, Miss Bennet, or should I say, Miss Kincaid. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Mrs. Miller, The older woman held up a hand. I don't need explanations right now. That man has the eyes of someone I wouldn't trust with a house cat, let alone a daughter. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a key. And the back stairs lead to the kitchen garden. Follow the alley to Elm Street, then go directly to the school. I'll tell him I haven't seen anyone matching his description. Stunned by this unexpected alliance, Eleanor could only whisper, "Thank you." "Thank me by being at the school on time," Mrs. Miller replied briskly. Miss Winters despises tardiness." Heart-pounding, Eleanor grabbed her shawl and Thomas's knife, then slipped out the back stairs as instructed. The morning air was cool against her flushed face as she hurried down the alley, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Her father had found her already, and if he was here, Thomas might be walking into danger without knowing it. Eleanor hurried through the back alleys of Mercy Hill, her heart hammering against her ribs. The town that had seemed like sanctuary just hours ago now felt like a trap closing around her. Every passing stranger, every opening door made her flinch with apprehension. The schoolhouse was a simple white clapboard building at the end of Elm Street, a small bell tower crowning its roof. Under different circumstances, Eleanor might have admired its neat appearance or the carefully tended flower beds flanking the entrance. Now she saw only a haven from pursuit. She slipped inside, finding herself in a large room filled with wooden desks arranged in neat rows. At the front, a slender woman with wire-rimmed spectacles was writing multiplication tables on a blackboard. She turned at the sound of the door, chalk poised mid-equation. "You must be Miss Bennet," she said, offering a tentative smile. "Mrs. Miller sent word you'd be coming. I'm Catherine Winters." "Yes, I apologize if I'm early," Eleanor replied, trying to master her ragged breathing. Miss Winters tilted her head, concern crossing her features. "Are you quite all right? You seem distressed." Eleanor struggled for composure. This meeting represented her chance at independence. She couldn't afford to appear unstable, just nervous about the interview, she managed. "Well, there's no need for that," Miss Winters assured her, setting down her chalk and brushing the dust from her fingers. "The children here are spirited but good-hearted. What experience do you have with teaching?" As Eleanor launched into her carefully prepared explanation about helping neighbor children with their letters, her mind raced in two directions at once. Part of her focused on making a favorable impression on Miss Winters, while another part remained hyper-aware of every sound from outside, dreading her father's appearance. "Mrs. Miller mentioned you're well-read," Miss Winters continued. "And what sorts of books do you enjoy?" The conversation progressed, gradually drawing Eleanor's full attention as she discovered in Miss Winters a kindred spirit, another woman who found joy in literature and learning. The teaching position, it emerged, would involve working with the younger children on basic reading and arithmetic, while Miss Winters focused on the older students. "The salary is modest, I'm afraid," Miss Winters said apologetically. $15 a month, with summers free. But for a single woman living at Mrs. Miller's, it's adequate. "It sounds perfect," Eleanor replied sincerely. Independence, meaningful work, and safety. Everything she'd dreamed of during those dark nights under her father's roof. "Wonderful. You can start Monday, if that suits. That will give you the weekend to settle in." Miss Winters smiled warmly. "And I have a feeling we'll work well together, Miss Bennet." The interview concluded with a tour of the schoolhouse, including the small library, really just a cupboard of well-worn books, and the playground outside. As they stepped into the yard, Eleanor's vigilance returned. She scanned the street beyond the schoolyard fence, tension returning to her shoulders. "Is someone meeting you?" Miss Winters asked, noticing her distraction. Before Eleanor could answer, movement at the corner caught her eye. Thomas appeared, walking casually along the street as if simply passing by. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw relief flash across his features before his expression returned to careful neutrality. He tipped his hat slightly, an acknowledgement for her eyes only, and continued walking. "No," Eleanor replied, relaxing slightly at the sight of him. "I no one's meeting me." She thanked Miss Winters and departed, deliberately taking the opposite direction from Thomas. He would find a way to contact her once it was safe, she knew. For now, she needed to avoid her father at all costs. Instead of returning directly to the boarding house, Eleanor made her way to the general store Mrs. Miller had mentioned. She needed a few essentials, a hairbrush, soap, perhaps another set of undergarments if her funds allowed. The practical errand would also give Thomas time to ensure the boarding house was safe. The store was busy with midday shoppers, offering Eleanor welcome anonymity among the crowd. She selected her items carefully, mindful of her limited resources. As she waited to pay, a conversation near the door caught her attention. "And looking for his daughter, says she's troubled in the head. Ran off 3 days ago. Poor man, traveling all this way." What's she look like? Young, dark hair, pretty, despite a yellowish bruise on her cheek. Says she might be using a false name. Eleanor kept her face turned away, blood rushing in her ears. She paid quickly and slipped out the side entrance, items clutched to her chest. The alley behind the store was empty. Thankfully, she leaned against the wall, struggling to control her panic. Her father was spreading his lies through town, painting her as mentally unstable, ensuring anyone who helped her would believe they were returning a sick girl to loving care rather than delivering her back to abuse. It was clever and terrifying in its effectiveness. "Miss Bennet." The voice behind her made Eleanor jump, a small cry escaping her lips. She whirled to find Thomas standing there, concern etched in his features. "It's all right," he said softly, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "I've been looking for you." "He's here," she whispered. "My father. He's telling everyone that I'm not right in the head." Thomas nodded grimly. "I know. Heard him at the saloon an hour ago, offering money for information." His jaw tightened. "Got a good look at him, too. Mean eyes. Like a man who enjoys having power over others." "Did he see you?" "No, I was careful." Thomas glanced toward the street. "We shouldn't talk here. Too exposed." "I can't go back to Mrs. Miller's," Eleanor said. "He was there this morning." "I know a place," Thomas replied. "Come on." He led her through a maze of back alleys and service passages between buildings, moving with the confidence of someone who'd already memorized the town's layout. They emerged behind the livery stable where Penny was boarded. Thomas guided her inside through the rear door. The stable was dim and warm, smelling of hay and horses. Thomas led her to an empty stall at the far end, where he'd apparently established a temporary base. His saddle and bags were stowed in the corner, and a bedroll was neatly laid out on clean straw. "The stableman lets me sleep here in exchange for help with the horses," he explained. "Safer than the hotel, and I can come and go without being noticed." Eleanor sank onto a hay bale, her purchases still clutched in her arms. "What are we going to do? If my father's offering rewards, someone will eventually tell him about the new school teacher." Thomas paced the narrow space, his expression thoughtful rather than panic. "We need to get you out of Mercy Hill," he said finally, "at least until he gives up and moves on." "But I just secured a position," Eleanor protested. "Now I can't simply disappear. Miss Winters is expecting me Monday. Better disappointed than finding you dragged back to your father's house," Thomas countered. "He has no legal right to force you back. You're of age, but in a small town like this, if enough people believe his story about your mental state." He didn't need to finish the thought. Eleanor knew all too well how appearances and reputation could trap a woman as effectively as any cage. "Where would I go?" she asked, the fight draining from her voice. Thomas sat beside her on the hay bale, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without actually touching. "I've been thinking about that. There's a place about 2 days' ride from here, a small ranch owned by a couple I know from my army days, Daniel and Mary Hollister. Good people, and far enough off the beaten path that your father wouldn't find you easily." "And then what? Hide forever?" Thomas shook his head. "Just long enough for your father to move on. Men like him, they burn hot but fast. When he doesn't find you in a week or two, he'll likely return home, convince himself you'll come crawling back when life gets hard." The assessment was accurate, Eleanor realized. Her father's rage was intense but rarely sustained. He expected immediate submission, not prolonged resistance. "These friends of yours," she said slowly, "would they take in a stranger based solely on your word?" "They would," Thomas replied with quiet certainty. Mary's sister was in a situation not unlike yours. They helped her start fresh out in Oregon territory. They understand. Eleanor studied his face, finding only sincerity in his expression. You've thought this through carefully. Had most of the night to consider options, he admitted. Didn't expect your father to arrive quite so quickly, but I'm not surprised he did. A question that had been nagging at Eleanor finally surfaced. Why are you doing all this? You could have ridden away after delivering me to the boarding house. Your obligation was fulfilled. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the stable wall beyond her shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. There was a girl once, he said, during the war, town in Tennessee that my unit passed through. She needed help getting away from a bad situation. I gave her money for a stage ticket, wished her well, and rode on, thinking I'd done enough. His jaw tightened. Found out later she never made it. Her husband caught her at the stage depot, brought her home, and he stopped, unable to continue. It wasn't your fault, Eleanor said softly. Maybe not, Thomas acknowledged, but I could have done more. Could have made sure she got on that stage safely. He finally met her eyes. I won't make the same mistake twice. The simple declaration, heavy with regret and determination, made something shift in Eleanor's chest. This wasn't just about duty or obligation for Thomas. It was about redemption, and perhaps something more personal that neither of them was ready to name. All right, she said. When do we leave? They departed Mercy Hill under cover of darkness, slipping out through the stable's rear entrance, where Thomas had Penny saddled and waiting. Eleanor had returned briefly to the boarding house while Thomas kept watch, retrieving her few belongings and leaving a carefully worded note for Mrs. Miller, not explaining everything, but enough to ensure the woman wouldn't worry or send a search party. I left something for Miss Winters as well, Eleanor told Thomas as they rode quietly along the town's edge, apologizing for my absence and expressing hope that I might return when circumstances allow. Thomas nodded his approval. Good thinking. Bridges are easier kept than rebuilt. The night enfolded them in its protective embrace as they put distance between themselves and Mercy Hill. The moon was waxing but not yet full, providing just enough light to navigate without making them easily visible from a distance. Thomas kept them to lesser-used trails, occasionally doubling back or taking seemingly unnecessary detours that Eleanor realized were designed to confuse any potential pursuit. They rode double on Penny again, Eleanor in front, Thomas's solid presence at her back. The arrangement had become almost comfortable now, their bodies finding a natural rhythm together on the horse. They spoke little during these first hours, both acutely aware of the need for stealth and speed. It was only when they stopped to rest near dawn, in a small copse of trees beside a gurgling stream, that Eleanor allowed herself to fully process what was happening. Once again, she was fleeing, her brief taste of settled independence snatched away by her father's relentless pursuit. It won't always be like this, Thomas said quietly, seeming to read her thoughts as he handed her a strip of jerky from his provisions. Running, I mean, won't it? Eleanor asked, unable to keep the weariness from her voice. What's to stop him from searching for me forever? His pride won't allow him to simply let me go. Thomas considered this as he unsaddled Penny, letting the mare drink from the stream. Men like your father, he said finally, they need to believe they're winning. When the chase becomes too costly, in time, in reputation, in money, they find ways to declare victory even in defeat. What do you mean? I mean, Thomas explained, settling beside her on a fallen log, that eventually he'll tell himself he's better off without such an ungrateful daughter. He'll reshape the story in his mind until you're the villain and he's the wronged party, deserving of sympathy rather than scorn for losing control of his household. The assessment was so accurate that Eleanor felt a chill despite the morning warmth. You understand him well. I understand his kind, Thomas corrected. Seen enough of them. The important thing is that you're free of him, whether he acknowledges it or not. They rested for an hour before continuing, allowing Penny a brief recovery and themselves a short nap in turn. Eleanor watched Thomas as he slept his allotted 30 minutes, studying the way his features softened in repose, the hard lines of caution momentarily erased. He looked younger, less weathered by life's storms. She wondered what path had led him to this nomadic existence, what dreams he might have harbored before loss carved them away. When he woke, catching her gaze on him, she didn't look away. Something was shifting between them, a tentative acknowledgement of connection that went beyond rescuer and rescued. They rode through the day, stopping only when necessary to rest Penny. The landscape changed gradually, becoming more varied as they headed northwest. Rolling grasslands gave way to scattered woods, rocky outcroppings, and occasional streams cutting through the terrain. Thomas seemed to know exactly where they were at all times, navigating without hesitation. "Have you traveled this route often?" Eleanor asked during one rest stop. Thomas shook his head. "Just twice, once during the war, once after to visit the Hollisters when they first settled here." He offered her the canteen. "I remember terrain well. Useful skill for a scout and for a man who doesn't stay in one place," she observed. A shadow crossed his features. "That too. Do you ever wish for something different?" The question slipped out before Eleanor could consider its implications. "A home, I mean, somewhere permanent." Thomas was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "Used to have those thoughts," he admitted. "After the war, had plans to build something lasting. Life had other ideas." He didn't elaborate, and Eleanor didn't press. They each carried private wounds, she realized. Perhaps that was part of what drew them to each other, a mutual recognition of pain endured and survived. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas became increasingly vigilant, frequently pausing to scan their back trail or listen for distant sound. Eleanor sensed his growing tension. "Do you think we're being followed?" she asked during one such stop. "Not sure," he replied, his expression grave. Something doesn't feel right." They altered their course slightly, taking an even less traveled path that required dismounting and leading Penny through particularly rough terrain. The extra caution cost them time, and darkness was falling when Thomas finally seemed to relax marginally. "We'll make camp here," he decided, indicating a small depression surrounded by oak trees, sheltered from view, but with clear lines of sight if anyone approaches. They worked together to establish their camp, the routine now familiar. Eleanor gathered wood while Thomas saw to Penny's needs. The small fire they built was carefully placed to minimize visible light while providing necessary warmth as the night air cooled. "Tomorrow afternoon, we should reach the Hollisters' place," Thomas said as they shared their simple meal. "Assuming we keep a steady pace." Eleanor nodded, relief mingling with an unexpected reluctance. Reaching safety should have been her only concern, yet she found herself strangely melancholy at the thought of their journey ending. These days with Thomas, despite their danger and discomfort, had awakened something in her she'd thought her father's cruelty had extinguished, a capacity for trust, for connection, for seeing possibility rather than threat in another's outstretched hand. "What will you do?" she asked. "After you've delivered me to your friends." Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, sparks rising like fireflies into the darkening sky. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Move on, I suppose. Like always. Is that what you want?" He looked up, surprise flashing across his features at the directness of her question. "Want doesn't factor much in my decisions these days," he said finally, "just one foot in front of the other, keeping promises where I can." "That sounds lonely," Eleanor observed, echoing words she'd spoken days earlier. This time, Thomas didn't deflect. "It is," he acknowledged quietly, "but it's simpler than the alternative, which is staying, building, losing." The three words carried the weight of his history, of lessons learned through pain. "Every time I've tried to create something lasting, it's been taken. After a while, a man stops trying." Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the layers of loss that had taught him to expect only impermanence. She recognized the protective shell he'd built around himself, not so different from her own carefully maintained walls. "What if," she said softly, "this time could be different?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. Thomas's eyes met hers across the fire, something vulnerable and yearning visible in their depths before he looked away. "But we should get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Long day tomorrow." Eleanor accepted the deflection, Understanding that some barriers couldn't be dismantled in a single conversation, they arranged their sleeping positions as before. Thomas closest to the approach, rifle within easy reach, Eleanor near the fire's warmth. Yet something had changed, an acknowledgement of possibility that hummed in the air between them like the tension before a storm breaks. She was drifting towards sleep when a sound jolted her to full alertness, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple riders moving fast. Thomas was already on his feet, rifle in hand. "Get your things," he whispered urgently. Quickly, Eleanor scrambled up, gathering her meager possessions with trembling hands. "Is it?" "Can't be sure," Thomas replied, dousing the fire with dirt. "But we're not waiting to find out." Within minutes, they were mounted on Penny, moving through the darkness away from the approaching rider. The mare seemed to sense their urgency, picking her way carefully but quickly through the night-shrouded terrain. "And there's an old line shack about 3 miles north," Thomas murmured, his mouth close to Eleanor's ear. "Used to be part of a cattle operation that went bust years ago. We can hole up there if needed." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Fear coiled in her stomach, not just for herself, but for Thomas. What would her father do if he caught the man who'd helped her escape? The possibilities made her blood run cold. They rode in tense silence, the sounds of pursuit fading and then, alarmingly, growing louder again. Whoever followed was skilled, tracking them even through the darkness. "They're gaining," Eleanor whispered. Thomas's arm tightened briefly around her waist. "Almost there," he assured her. "Just a little further." As they crested a small rise, Eleanor caught sight of a dark structure silhouetted against the night sky. The line shack Thomas had mentioned. It was little more than a crude cabin, weathered by years of neglect. But in that moment, it represented their only hope of sanctuary. They reached it just as the moon emerged from behind a cloud, bathing the landscape in silver light that made Eleanor feel terribly exposed. Thomas dismounted swiftly, helping her down before leading Penny around to the back of the structure. "Inside," he directed, guiding Eleanor toward the door. "No matter what happens, stay there until I come for you." "Thomas," she began, fear making her voice catch. He turned to her, his expression intense in the moonlight. For a heartbeat, she thought he might say more, might finally give voice to the unspoken connection growing between them. Instead, he simply touched her cheek briefly, the gesture conveying what words could not. "Trust me," he said softly. "One more time." Eleanor slipped inside the line shack, heart pounding as Thomas secured the door behind her. The interior was sparse, a rough table, a broken chair, the remnants of a makeshift bed in one corner. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting thin silver lines across the dusty floor. Outside, Thomas moved Penny to a small lean-to behind the structure, speaking softly to calm the nervous mare. Eleanor pressed her eye to a gap in the weathered boards, watching as he checked his rifle and positioned himself in the shadows beside the cabin. The approaching riders had slowed, moving cautiously now. Eleanor counted 3 silhouettes against the moonlit horizon, her father flanked by the Jenkins men, just as before. They halted about 50 yards from the cabin, conferring in low voices that didn't carry to her hiding place. Thomas remained perfectly still, a shadow among shadows, the discipline of a former scout evident in his patience, his control. Her father's voice suddenly cut through the night, harsh and commanding. "I know you're there, girl. Show yourself." Eleanor flinched at the familiar tone, the voice that had dominated her life for so long. Her body's instinctive response to obey warred with her newfound determination to remain free. "You've caused enough trouble," Ezekiel Kincaid continued when no response came. "Time to come home where you belong." Thomas remained silent, watching the men from his concealed position. They hadn't spotted him yet, their attention focused on the cabin. "Send out that man you're traveling with too," her father added, his tone darkening. "I got some business with him about taking what isn't his." The words sent a chill through Eleanor. She wasn't property to be stolen. She was a person who had chosen to leave. The realization strengthened her resolve. Her father had no power here except what fear gave him. The 3 men dismounted, tethering their horses to a stunted oak. Lester Jenkins carried a lantern, its yellow glow harsh after the soft silver of moonlight. Caleb Jenkins had a shotgun cradled in his arms, while her father's hand rested on the revolver at his hip. "Last chance to come out peaceful-like," her father called. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." When silence was the only response, he nodded to the Jenkins men. They spread out, approaching the cabin from different angles. Caleb circled toward the back, directly toward Thomas's position. Eleanor bit her lip to keep from crying out a warning. Thomas saw the danger. He slipped around the corner of the structure, staying in shadow, his movements fluid and silent. Lester Jenkins reached the cabin door first, testing the crude latch. Finding it secured from inside, he glanced back at Ezekiel Kincaid, who gave a curt nod. Jenkins raised his boot and kicked hard, splintering the weathered wood around the latch. The door swung open. Eleanor pressed herself against the far wall, Thomas's small knife clutched in her trembling hand. "Come out, girl," Lester Jenkins growled, raising the lantern to illuminate the cabin's interior. "Your pa's waiting." Eleanor swallowed hard, finding her voice. "I'm not going back. I'm of age, and I'm making my own choices now." Her father appeared in the doorway behind Jenkins, his face contorted with familiar rage. "You ungrateful little—" "That's far enough," Thomas's voice came from behind them, steady and cold as steel. He stood in the yard, rifle trained on the two men. Step away from the door. Ezekiel Kincaid turned slowly, eyes narrowing as he took in the man who'd helped his daughter escape. "This doesn't concern you, stranger." "Miss Kincaid asked for my help," Thomas replied evenly. That makes it my concern. She's my daughter. She's her own woman." Thomas cut him off. "And she's made her choice clear." The tension stretched between them like a bowstring pulled too tight. Eleanor could see her father calculating, weighing his chances. Where was Caleb Jenkins? The question sent another surge of fear through her. The answer came with brutal swiftness. A shadow detached itself from the side of the cabin. Caleb Jenkins emerging from his flanking position, shotgun leveled at Thomas's back. "Drop it," he ordered. Thomas didn't move, keeping his rifle trained on Ezekiel Kincaid and Lester Jenkins. "You won't get a second shot," he warned Caleb quietly. "Think carefully about whether this is worth dying for." Uncertainty flickered across the younger Jenkins's face. "He's bluffing," Ezekiel snarled. "Shoot him!" In the frozen moment that followed, Eleanor made her decision. She stepped forward into the doorway, directly into her father's line of sight. "If he dies, I'll never go with you," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'll run so far you'll never find me. Is that what you want, Father? To return home empty-handed, having killed a man for nothing?" Her father's face twisted with conflicting emotions, rage, calculation, grudging recognition of the truth in her words. For all his cruelty, he'd always been practical. A dead body meant questions, possibly charges. The story of a mentally unstable daughter wouldn't shield him from a murder investigation. "The girl isn't worth hanging for," Lester Jenkins muttered. "And let's just go, Zeke." "Shut up," Ezekiel snapped, but doubt had crept into his expression. Eleanor pressed her advantage. "Leave now. Tell everyone I died if your pride needs it, but know that if you try to force me back, only one of us will survive the experience." She raised Thomas's knife, letting moonlight catch the blade. I won't be a prisoner again, not even for a single day." The conviction in her voice seemed to finally penetrate her father's certainty. He stared at her as if seeing a stranger wearing his daughter's face. "You're just like your mother," he said finally. The words half accusation, half revelation, stubborn to the bone. "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly, "I am. And she would be proud of me now." Something shifted in Ezekiel Kincaid's eyes. Not surrender exactly, but recognition of a battle that couldn't be won through force. He stepped back, jaw tight with thwarted rage. "Come on!" he ordered the Jenkins men. "She's made her choice." "But," Caleb began. "I said come on." The three men backed away, Caleb keeping his shotgun trained on Thomas until the last possible moment. They mounted their horses, Ezekiel casting one final hard glance at his daughter. "Don't come crawling back when life gets hard," he spat. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Goodbye, Father." They watched in tense silence as the three riders departed, their figures gradually swallowed by darkness. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Thomas lower his rifle, shoulders slumping slightly as tension drained from his body. "They might circle back," he warned, though his tone suggested he didn't believe they would. "No," Eleanor said with quiet certainty. "He's done. His pride won't let him return after being refused so clearly." Thomas studied her face in the moonlight, something like wonder in his expression. "You stood your ground, faced him down." "I had help," she replied simply, looking at the man who'd risked everything for her. "You gave me the chance to find my courage." Thomas shook his head. "The courage was always yours. You just needed space to remember it." They stood in silence for a moment, the night settling around them like a blanket. The danger had passed, leaving them in a strange, quiet aftermath where everything seemed both more real and more dreamlike than before. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked finally. Thomas looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. "We still head for the Hollisters. It's safer, at least for a while. And after that?" He turned back to her, his expression softening. "That depends. On what? On what you want." "Eleanor." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the questions in his eyes, the carefully restrained hope. "You fought hard for the freedom to choose your own path. I won't presume to decide where it leads." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple gift he offered, the right to determine her own future, without pressure or expectation. After years of having her choices made for her, the openness of possibility was overwhelming. "What if," she said softly, echoing her question from the night before, "my path might run alongside yours, at least for a while?" Thomas's breath caught audibly. "I'm not a settled man," he cautioned, though she could hear the wavering in his resolve. "I don't have much to offer." "You offered me your hand when I needed it most," Eleanor reminded him, taking a step forward to close the distance between them. "You showed me what kindness looks like without demands attached. That's more than most could give." Tentatively, almost reverently, Thomas raised his hand to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I never expected to find someone who would make me want to stay in one place again," he admitted. "Never thought I'd meet someone brave enough to make me believe in possibilities." Eleanor leaned into his touch, her heart racing with something entirely different from fear. And I'm not asking for promises," she whispered, "just a chance to discover who we might be together, now that we're both truly free." The first rays of sunrise spilled across the landscape, bathing them in golden light. Thomas Blackwood, the wandering horseman who had rescued her more thoroughly than he knew, gazed down at her with eyes full of wonder and nascent joy. "I'd like that," he said simply. When he bent to kiss her, Eleanor rose to meet him, their lips touching with the tender hesitancy of two people learning to trust again. It was a beginning rather than an ending, a door opening to possibilities neither had dared imagine days earlier. Later, as they rode toward the Hollisters' ranch, the morning sun warm on their backs, Thomas reached around Eleanor to adjust Penny's reins. His arm lingered at her waist, a gentle embrace that asked nothing but offered everything. Eleanor covered his hand with her own, their fingers intertwining as naturally as their paths had merged. Behind them, the rising sun transformed the eastern sky into a canvas of gold and promise, illuminating the road they'd traveled and the one stretching ahead. Together, they rode toward tomorrow,